In 2016, the American Values Survey done by Public Religion Research Institute found that, quote, no issue in 2016 is viewed by more Americans as important today than terrorism, with 70% saying it is a critical issue to them personally. And back then in 2016, over 4 in 10 Americans, almost 50% of Americans, said immigration was an issue of critical importance. So Trump, over the course of his election campaign in 2015 and 16, really conflated the idea of terrorism and immigration in the minds of many, many, many voters across the country. Then they did a survey in 2020. They just released, I would say, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago. In 2020, PRI found that terrorism as a defining issue had had dropped to 45%, had gone from 70% in 2016 to 45% in 2020. What's important to voters now is the coronavirus pandemic at 60%. And then, kind of issues around the economy and jobs. So I think one reason why immigration has not been a kind of a driving factor for the campaign so far is because Trump, quite frankly, and politicians overall have not had the opportunity to conflate the kind of very visceral and emotional story that energizes many people. But I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind here. In 2018, I would argue that a significant number of suburban voters ended up parting ways with the Republican Party because of the child separation crisis along the border. So I think another reason why Trump has not been talking about immigration as much is that he realizes that in 2018 it was a losing issue for for voters. Now, in the last 48 hours, we've seen an uptick in conversation or rhetoric from the Trump campaign around immigration. Stephen Miller has done a few interviews over the last few days, speaking to continuing to cut legal immigration, continuing to slash the refugee admissions cap. So the Trump campaign is trying to kind of gin up people. Now, the Biden campaign on their end, they have, I would argue, kind of stayed away from the issue, other than kind of speaking to DACA or Dreamers, kind of very broad brush comments. But also in the last 48 hours, they've released a video speaking very specifically to the child separation crisis, and calling for and committing to a federal task force to reunite the 545 children that remain separated. But I think the more interesting and almost more important story that needs to be told is the role of immigrants and immigration in small town America. And that's either kind of rural parts of the country or suburban parts of the country. So, there's a lot of talk these days about Texas, right? And this massive turnout in Texas is coming from voters, Latino and white voters in Texas. But as you probably know, in Texas, it's Fort Bend County in Texas, which is actually one of the most diverse counties in Texas, and has this massive Asian population and South Asian population. So telling those kinds of stories of how the Asian community and communities kind of beyond the Latino community are politically engaging, or contributing to the response and recovery to COVID-19, I think are really, really important stories to tell. I think as advocates, we have missed an opportunity to build the coalition of voters and policymakers who see immigration as a priority. And what I mean by that is, for us, for example, we do a lot of work with conservative and moderate faith, law enforcement, business leaders. And we just find that by bringing them into the conversation alongside the immigrant community, then a policymaker, whether it is somebody like potentially President Biden, or a Republican or Democrat in Congress, they realize that the need for constructive immigration reforms is not limited to demands coming from the immigrant community. The demands coming from the immigrant community are being echoed and supported by a broad spectrum of voters across, from Democratic to Independent to Republican. So I think if we do have an opportunity in the years ahead, we have to learn the lessons of the past and realize that the coalition that's necessary to pressure a Pelosi, a Biden, or a Schumer to actually move something forward and to spend the political capital necessary to move something forward requires that those of us on the outside build these much broader and inclusive coalitions that are, yes, still are being led by and defined by the immigrant community, the immigrant voice, but are bringing along the rest of the country. And we don't do ourselves a disservice by, kind of siloing our demands. Look, if it is a second term of a Trump administration, we will continue to see cuts to legal immigration. I mean, over the course of his time in office, we've seen a cut by over 50% since COVID. In essence, immigration has been almost completely closed. I think with a Trump second term, we'll see cuts to legal immigration. We will see continued attacks on DACA recipients. Those with temporary protected status will lose their status, and we'll see 400,000 individuals and their families being forced to return to their home country. So I think the list of things that a Trump administration will do to reduce immigration, take away whatever rights are left for immigrants, that's the reality that we'll face.